Let me preface my talk with a couple of observations about what motivated me to write this book. One of them is a deep anxiety about rewriting my work. And that's something I struggle with. My previous work dealt with Al Jazeera. I've written 2 books, and the temptation is there to write yet a third one, because after with the Arab uprisings, Al Jazeera became even more interesting, acquiring a presence in the U.S., a global network player. So I resisted that temptation. I wanted to do something that is really different. 2, I was working on a book in 2010, and when the Arab uprisings came about, what I was working on became slightly warped. My friend and colleague Mike Hudson told me that probably fortunately. So it was about, this is the influence of School of Foreign Service on me. I was looking at media and state security within the Middle East. It's still relevant probably to the Gulf rather than to the broader and changing Middle East. I may revisit that at some point. The third motivation for writing this book is there were really interesting questions that for which we don't have answers, and I thought I could contribute some answers, particularly about Middle East media and uprisings. My fourth motivation is I wanted to do something that is grounded in field work, but also that has a theoretical relevance. So the background of this is that a couple of years ago I became enamored with media anthropology. That's not, I was not trained as an anthropologist, but increasingly people who are coming up with interesting work, at least within Middle East media, have been people who are not in the schools of communication, but who came to it from anthropology. So you are a specialist on Egypt, and you happen to observe media practice in Egypt. Some of the really insightful work came out of that. What brought that mainstream, in a way, interestingly, is a colleague of you, Marwan, writing about entertainment and reality TV within the Arab world, and suddenly that became really an interesting school. And I think I try to align myself with those findings and build on them. Now, a couple of excitements and challenges about the book. The excitement, I really didn't know what I was looking for. I didn't know if there was something to really unravel. And I'll talk particularly in the case of Tunisia, whether it was worth writing a whole book. And theoretically, what does the case study really tell us? Publishers were not really interested in a case study about Tunisia. You go to Mesa and panel after panel, they tell you Egypt is the country to study, is the country to look for the future. And as soon as the conference is over, something happened in Egypt that makes it an anomaly, if you want. Other challenges, doing field work. Going to the middle of this country with an IRB and doing field work is really a challenge. I mean, people become suspicious. It's just, and then people, but people were I mean, in good faith. They were willing to help. It's hit and miss, but all of that is really what made the book interesting. What I have to offer is 2 things. One, I'd like to look at. I'd like to share with you my theoretical contribution. So that's the focus of my talk, and probably with the Q&A I can elaborate more on specific cases that deal with the research. In late 2010 and early 2011, Tunisia experienced an extraordinary historical moment that took the world by surprise. A spontaneous youth-led movement put the country on a new course, overthrowing one of the iconic figures of modern Arab authoritarianism. This unprecedented event proved to be a turning point in the history of the Arab world that altered what seemed for a long time to be an immutable political reality. Within a matter of days, demonstrations broke in Egypt. A few months later, or weeks later, there were protests in Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, Algeria, Syria, bringing hopes of enduring social and political changes, but at the same time, hopes that were tinged with fear and an anxiety about the unknown. No account of these uprisings is probably complete without reference to digital activism. In the popular imagination and in academic circles alike, revolutionary moments, and momentous changes some Arab countries witnessed were intimately connected to an unprecedented media momentum that fueled what Castell calls networked of outrage and hope. The emphasis on the centrality, what is interesting about the emphasis on the centrality of information and communication technologies to political change is that it stood in stark contrast to the predominant narrative of only a few years ago, which emphasized the Middle East region's aversion to change and the inconsequential nature of its altered communication environment. So in the 90s, you get the advent of satellite television that opened up a very promising public sphere. Starting from 1999 onwards, you got the widespread adoption of the internet, which seemed to undermine the hegemonic control of Arab governments over information. At the same time, these changes and transformations were inconsequential. It means they didn't lead to anything. And the best thing that scholars of the Middle East could come up with is the theory of the public sphere. I was one of them. I tried, and of course, it's a normative theory that has its limitations, because it's embedded in claims about democracy and media within a Western, more specifically German context, European context. So even though the energized media sphere helped break the state monopoly over public discourse, and the new culture of connectivity helped democratize the right to access information and interpret events in the Middle East, the effect on the region's political culture remained unpalpable. Now, the post-2010 master narrative that emerged emphasized the exact opposite, which is the role ICT play in political change. While some studies extend old arguments about what is often conceived as ongoing technology-enabled democratization processes, others are more interested in the dynamics of social movements by digitally enabled and globally connected actors. During the early months of the uprisings, many pundits hailed the centrality of media to the revolution, attributing massive importance to its role in circulating information, raising consciousness, and coordinating protests. Deeming social media as a potent force and a game changer, they effusively described the events in Tunisia, Egypt, and beyond as Twitter revolutions, Facebook revolutions, and so on and so forth. Now, that narrative reflected a tendency among communication technology enthusiasts to champion the emancipatory potential of technology. And there's a history to this. If we go back to Daniel Lerner's The Passing of Traditional Society, it considered mass media as a driver of economic and political modernization. So by eroding the government's ability to control information, the argument goes, new communication technologies have helped build a freer and more open society. Increasingly, new digital spaces for dissent are becoming a source of challenge to closed political systems. By enhancing the ability to organize protests, coordinate action, disseminate information, share video footage, and amplify events, increasingly affordable communication technologies and accessible media are viewed as helping people under authoritarian systems acquire a net advantage. Of course, not everybody agrees with this narrative or shares the technology enthusiast optimism. Now, for skeptics, reducing social movements to a media effect smacks of technological determinism. And you're all familiar with the debate between Shirky and Morozov. For the latter, advancing technology are empowering states. Because of surveillance, their ability to monitor what people are doing. And not only that, but there is a range of, there is a lot of literature that talks about how authoritarian states are able to modernize and adapt to this reality. And the whole context is, in a way, even outside media studies, is how the Middle East is able to upgrade its authoritarian band by small openings that later enable them to claim more control. So neither the story of the technology-enabled revolutions toppling Arab dictators and bringing in sweeping political changes, nor the narrative of authoritarian rulers controlling information and stifling online dissent provide a nuanced understanding of the media experience in the MENA region. So what I'm proposing here is 3 lines of analysis for any new insights to emerge. One, we have to break away from the cause and effect type of analysis of the media and communication sphere in the Middle East, particularly its political import. So if we're looking at effects, there is only so much that we can prove. There is so much that we can find. A central focus of the debates has been largely political effects. That is, whether A, the new communication environment could play a transformative role and have a democratizing potential, or B, whether the altered media environment is undermined by evolutionary adjustments and non-democratic alterations geared toward shoring up regime stability. Now, this binary formulation leaves a number of significant dynamics unexplored with regard to the nature and workings of changing media practices and the way the media experience intersects with broader social context, cultural dynamics, and political realities. So that's the first claim. The second proposition is that we have to reconsider who are the players and, in fact, what we consider as the playing field. Let me elaborate on that. The MENA region is marked by an unprecedented youth bulge, with half of the population being less than 25 years old. Generally speaking, scholarship about the region has been dismissive of this demographic category as being unable to effect change, partly because, despite its size, Arab youth have been largely marginalized from institutional political life. The perceived political irrelevance of youth, though, is only an obvious instance of understudied changes that are affecting an entire generation, including altered traditions of authority, improved level of education, and changes in the reach and nature of mass communication practices. It is not that these changes went unnoticed, but whenever they are noted, it is in relation to the potential for political action. And when we talk about politics, it's usually capital P. Formal, institutional, party politics. At best, if it's not that, it's civil society that pressures or that pressures political players. Now, this gets me to my third proposition. We need to revisit our very conception of what is delimited as the sphere of politics. Hence the subtitle of my book, The Politics of Everyday Life. What is interesting to me is not so much the extent to which growing public access to and intense use of various forms of information and communication technologies are eroding state control over political life, but the way they are changing the nature of political engagement itself. New ways of creating, consuming, and using information have arguably brought about subtle dynamic forms of political engagement that are engendering alternative forms of citizen action and reconfiguring the relationship between the state and its citizens. I will say more later on the political dimension, particularly the politics of everyday life. Let me spell out for now some key questions that are worth teasing out. Now, the key question for me that I pose in the book is, how do young people get politicized on the internet? Because we thought they were not concerned with politics. So what happens, rather than how access to the internet can bring down regimes? And once we understand that, then maybe the second question becomes irrelevant. Maybe that opens up new kind of lines of analysis that enable us to provide new insights. Now, out of this question, I'd like to tease out a few others. How are the mediated sociocultural practices that emerge in recent years at the intersection of the real and the virtual world affecting agency? How is the changing communication culture altering subjectivity? How do forms of online engagement bear on identity negotiation? Are participatory media leading to new or different forms of sociality, and in what ways? And how have communication practices that are embedded in social networks redefining the practice of politics and the meaning of citizenship? Answering these questions with sufficient depth necessitates moving beyond facile generalization to specific contexts. Focusing on individual cases is also valuable to help us avoid a pervasive tendency in the regional scholarship to homogenize the Arab and Middle East digital experience. And I'd like to believe that, what's happening in Yemen is dramatically different from what's happening in Iraq, in spite of the commonalities. Very different from what's happening in Morocco and so on and so forth, and Iran and so on and so forth. Additionally, grounding the analysis in contextual realities and highlighting the specificity of particular experiences can create the basis for a much-needed comparative theorization of media practices and experiences. Now, I contribute to these debates on the political sociology of new media in the region through an in-depth study of the case of the Tunisian digital experience. Anchored as it is in Tunisia, and the challenge for me, how do I write a book about Tunisia without being a Tunisia specialist? Meaning, I don't want to be a Tunisia. I don't want to, I want this to be, what does this tell me about the region, and how can I use that to look beyond the region? So for me, it is a case study more than in a way, global trends, more than Tunisia in and of itself. Anchored in as it is in Tunisian experience, the book is also necessarily about digital activism in an authoritarian context. It takes a close look at an array of forms of online communication that arose within the larger socio-political context of the authoritarian state. The book explores the various forms of digital contention and different modalities of online resistance that authoritarianism breeds within an increasingly intense communication environment that is conducive to new kinds of sensibilities, experiences, and actions. In a nutshell, it tells the story of the co-evolution of technology and society in a specific Arab setting in which the aspirations of digitally empowered publics were often at odds with the instincts of repressive regimes. Let me start with tentative answers to the central question that motivates my investigation, which is what happens when networked Arab publics are shut out of the political arena under an authoritarian political system. I find that significant forms of political engagement develop outside of conventional political frameworks, giving rise to a culture of contention. Exploring how this culture of contention takes hold can bring to light evolving forms of political engagement, in particular, the tendency of digital communication to reconfigure political action within ordinary, everyday experiences. Of particular interest is the extent to which mediated practices that developed on the margins of institutional political life shaped political consciousness. No less significant are the dynamics of seemingly depoliticized youth becoming politicized in the digital era, and the proclivity of networked publics to negotiate agency and reimagine citizenship. So the case of Tunisia, for me, is important or significant the digital experience, because it constitutes a laboratory for examining the changing state-society relationship within this altered media environment. Now, as I mentioned earlier, scholarship on the double bind of media and politics has been locked in a perspective that is premised on functional and instrumentalist approaches toward media that obscure functional, meaning what does it lead, what's the effect, what does it lead to? And this is also tied with funding. I mean, I mean, there's something that I'm not talking about, the funding for digital activists before 2010 and pumping money into civil society. The whole idea that that's what will bring change. But that's a digression. Maybe you can go back to later. So this instrumental approach toward media that obscure the complex nature of media use and the significance of the broader context within which media habits develop. Not only is internet use embedded in specific contexts that cannot be ignored, but the internet is itself the space of social participation where the various aspects of sociality interact and intersect, where power dynamics are articulated and where power relations are constructed, not just the means of activism. In this perspective, what people do on the internet is as important as the question of what people do with the internet. And I focus on the former. Taking heed of these complexities calls for a reformulation of the terms of the inquiry in a way that refocuses the analysis away from causation to dynamics. We need to explore how internet usage and digital communication technologies matter instead of just looking at their immediate effects. That necessarily entails eschewing the emphasis on the instrumental use of the internet, treating it not so much as a tool to coordinate dissent and mobilize people, but as a set of practices and processes that are embedded in everyday life. I'm particularly interested in the gradual emergence of a contentious mediated culture. The specific questions that follow from this formulation pertain to the altered sensibilities that developed in tandem with the evolving culture of communication. So rather than attempt to tell the story of the region's political changes in a media-intensive era, this case study probes how internet usage and mediated interactions allowed changes to the category of the political itself. And this is something that I'm going to come back to later. Not political communication, but the politics of communication. I thus leave behind the comfort zone that has marked the literature on the relationship between information and communication technologies and sociopolitical change to examine the emergence and development of what I call digital spaces of contention. Now, what does that mean? I use the term digital culture of contention, digital spaces of contention, and contentious digital culture interchangeably to designate an amalgam of social interactions, citizen forms of engagement, cultural spaces, ordinary activities, and mundane pursuits that intersect with, are embedded in media experiences, anchored in participatory networks, and intertwined with processes of communication. Contentious digital culture describes dynamics that take shape within an evolving communication culture encompassing a variety of information technologies, media platforms, and communication tools, which means it's not just limited to the internet. Contention emerges less as an overt dissidence, and that's why it's not resistance, it's not dissidence, and more as forms of assertiveness. Contention invokes a set of practices, interactions, engagements, articulations, contestations, and rejections that are not necessarily politically framed. Instead, they are political in other ways. Grasping these political dynamics in their full complexity necessitates an interdisciplinary investigations of spaces that are less formal than a typical political analysis would warrant. Tunisia provides a rich and interesting case study that stands out as much for its singularity as it does for its commonality with other Arab nations. It was the first Arab country to connect to the internet, and also the site of the first Arab uprisings. Now, a friend of me pushed me to ask the question if there is a correlation, and I resisted. Precisely because I wanted to work with a different mindset, different frame. The broader implication of the case of Tunisia is that it eliminates the acute dilemma of authoritarianism, in this case Middle East authoritarianism, in the age of digital media. On the one hand, the country subsisted for nearly a quarter of a century under a regime that proved adept at modernizing authoritarianism. On the other hand, it adopted an avant-garde internet development model and sought to build a digital infrastructure capable of positioning it as a pioneer. Balancing the unlimited promises and subversing potential of new technologies was not easy for the state, particularly because, in this case, the regime considered societal empowerment a threat. The regime's desire to connect people to modern information and communication technologies while simultaneously striving to keep them politically disconnected would prove untenable over the years. The incongruous nature of these two factors contributed to the development of the digital culture I talked about, or I describe in this work. Understanding that culture calls for a historically grounded and theoretically informed analysis of micro-practices, micro-processes, cultural practices, and societal interactions that intersect with, are embedded in media usage, production, and consumption, and anchored in evolving trends of socialized, mundane communication. And one of the things that I do, while everybody is looking at what happened during the uprisings, I take that as the point, as the end point for me. And what I say, I'm going to look back. Now, luckily, I have, 16 years. That's when a 16-year window, and that's in a way manageable. So when everybody was trying to look at what happened to the uprisings onwards, I said, no, let me backstep and see what is it that we have missed. The unsuspected complexity of such experience has not received the attention it deserves. A number of social scientists had studied contemporary Tunisia only because it was a case of a phenomenon they were otherwise interested in. And the most common of studies or motivation for studying Tunisia are two. One is women, and two is politics. Women freedom, and political authoritarianism. So people come to the case of Tunisia already with a framed question, and that, in a way, undermined interesting findings that were undermined. I mean, these are legitimate questions, no doubt about it. But when the analysis is limited to that, I think it warps, I think, the findings. So one notable exception. Not that there is no good scholarship about Tunisia. One notable exception is a book by a French political scientist / sociologist, Béatrice Hibou. It's called The Force of Obedience. It took her about 10 years to write this book, and when she set out to do her field research, her question was about the economics of Tunisia, and then little by little she found that that's the nature of research. They told her, no, you're looking at the wrong spot, and then she started to redirect her questions to where she thought she's onto something. Hibou examines the political economy from the political economy to the political economy of repression. Specifically, how the exercise of domination is infused in economic dynamics that permeate people's daily lives and subjects them to a regime many came to view as their only option. The central question driving her analysis is how people come to accept or even support practices of domination. Her analysis or her answer is that domination is woven into everyday social practices. What she does in her book is reformulate the question of power along the lines developed by Foucault. The book is very Foucauldian. She acknowledges that. Namely, shifting the analysis from institutions to techniques. Institutions of power to techniques of power. I mean, I'm not going to rehearse Foucault here. So following Foucault, Hibou reinscribes power and the analysis of power within the productive apparatuses ensconced in the realm of everyday life, rather than associate them with localizable repressive institutions, whether they are government structures, political institutions, or economic organizations. And she looks away from these three. Now, so what does that mean? What makes Tunisia a repressive state and a perfect police state before 2010 is not the 120,000 or 150,000 police agents that the Ministry of Interior, that are on the payroll of the Ministry of Interior, but rather the network of intelligence the regime put in place that has nothing to do with ideological, with state apparatuses. And these include taxi drivers who are supposed to have a conversation with you and know where you're going, whether you're a tourist or what you are up to somebody who wants to set up a business and he needs to report what's happening in the neighborhood to get the license, to the guy who has who runs a Xerox, a small Xerox machine in this shop, who is supposed to look at everything you are supposed to photocopy, pretending that he's adjusting this. And the idea is that, I mean, those are intimate practices. And she's saying that that's what repression takes place within everyday life practices rather than the police state. So insightful as it may be, Hibu's work is more concerned with the application of power and the processes through which subjects are constituted than the subversive potential subjects develop under such a system. So again, the focus is on power, the panopticon. Although the account she offers pays particular attention to tensions and small-scale confrontations in everyday life by everyday actors that render control more utopian than real, it nonetheless affirms the prevalence of the force of obedience over the force of disobedience. And the name of the title of her book is The Force of Obedience. So at the end of the day, people cooperate, people accept, people consent. Even if people are at times disposed to reject the system or object to its workings, they inevitably conform to it, and in doing so, they reaffirm their subjection. And interestingly, Charles Kurzman has the sociologist has an interesting article that analyzes this. I mean, couple of days before Ben Ali fell, Hibu was interviewed, and she still thought, well, the regime was strong enough to. But don't get me wrong. I mean, her book is really fascinating. Now, this authoritarian predicament notwithstanding, subjection did not necessarily preclude the development of an impetus that is capable of yielding dynamics and dispositions that could be potentially consequential. For Foucault himself, relationships of power are far from being stable or static, insofar as configurations of power can potentially induce resistance. As he put it, quote, "There is no relationship of power without the means of escape. Every power relation implies that, at least in potential, a strategy, every power relation implies, at least in potential, a strategy of struggle," end of quote. These counterdynamics are more extensively and more explicitly described in Michel de Certeau's The Practice of Everyday Life, which is concerned with the way subjects negotiate their position of power within a particular system, while reiterating Foucault's conceptualization of the way disciplinary technologies, productive apparatuses, and microphysics of power could become extensive and all-encompassing. He brings to light clandestine forms taken by the dispersed and tactical creativity of groups or individuals already in the nets of discipline, end of quote. For de Certeau, what is important to note is not simply the web of discipline technologies that power create, but also how marginality is renegotiated and how subjects are otherwise weak, who are otherwise weak or dominated, reappropriate spaces, discourses, and practices using various tactics, which he dubs, quote, the art of the weak, which also, a couple of years later, James Scott calls the arts of resistance. If these tactics are articulated in everyday life, it is not because everyday life practices are tactical in essence. It is not only because they are tactical in essence, but also because they are political in nature. In other words, in the words of de Certeau, quote, "The ingenuous ways in which the weak make use of the strong lend a political dimension to everyday life practices," end of quote. For a sociologist of the Middle East, like Asf Bayat, The everyday life of ordinary people constitutes a de facto site of resistance. That's where we ought to be looking at resistance. And Bayet was one of the very few people who are trying to find, to at least identify and posit such spaces. It breeds dynamics of change that often go unnoticed because they are associated with, quote, unconventional forms of agency and activism, and articulated around alternative venues of resistance that have the proclivity of reinventing prevailing norms through creative innovation. In Life as Politics, Bayat draws attention to a variety of social practices, primarily in urban settings, through which ordinary people either resist or subvert domination. These social non-movements, as he calls them, interlock activism with the practice of everyday life, bringing together fragmented collectives and devising strategies of, quote, the quiet encroachment of the ordinary, end of quote, on the authority of the repressive state. In the age of social media, these tendencies are even further enhanced. What is of interest for me in all of this is not so much the propensity of everyday digital practices to generate social movements or non-movements, but the very experience of politics that everyday life lends to, everyday life tends to inscribe networked publics in, irrespective of whether they see themselves involved in politics or not. To the extent that it is enmeshed with everyday life practices that could potentially affect power relations, the digital experience is inherently political, even if the political dimension is elusive. For the sociologist Henri Lefebvre, the concept of everyday life is intrinsic to social reality, which is tantamount to saying that it is hard to think of culture outside of everyday life. At the same time, and by definition, the everyday is that which escapes us, being marked by both opacity and ambiguity. In other words, the significance of everyday life for Henri Lefebvre lies precisely in its seeming insignificance. It gets more exciting when everyday life becomes indissociable from media, particularly new media, within the newly enacted digital space. Annabel Srebrny perceptively argued that, quote, especially within repressive regimes, when there appears to be no public space for political activity, media fosters the politicization of the cultural, end of quote. The mediated forms of culture that emerges in such contexts are inherently political, though often in intricate and unsuspected ways. Now, what does this mean, and where does this leave us? A sociopolitical inquiry into the workings of the digital experience calls for a particular attention to the political dimension, but also a reconceptualization of where politics manifests itself and what it encompasses. I argue that the focus on formal or institutional politics writes off the non-political nature of the political. In doing so, it impoverishes the category of the political. In this regard, the case at hand helps shed light on the ways in which online communications, interactions, practices, usages, and interrelations foster what may be termed, after Srebrny, quote, creative adaptations of the political possibilities of the moment, and thereby reshape the power dynamics as such. A set of interrelated questions arise from this formulation. What are the socio-political underpinnings of internet use in an authoritarian political system? How are political sensibilities articulated in such a context? What form do they take and under which conditions do they become pronounced? If we assume that the internet helped nurture political consciousness, stimulate interest, and increase engagement among the youth, through which mechanisms did this reinsertion occur, and what were the arenas, spaces, and modalities of this engagement? What is not well understood is how young people develop political interest on the internet and how they become politicized in a controlled environment that is characterized by the absence of political freedoms. If we can see that the internet offers a new terrain for political engagement for Arab youth and Middle East youth who are believed to have abandoned politics a long time ago, how do they move from political apathy to political involvement? How are they drawn to activism? How is the evolving digital environment redefining the nature of resistance, and what kind of experiences figure behind this repositioning? Lastly, how do seemingly non-political, not to say mundane actions acquire a political valence? I have a lot more to say, but I'm going to stop here and hoping that we can have a conversation. And if you want me to comment more concretely on the substantive part of the book, I'll be happy to do so.